They say the house did not breathe, it exhaled. The shutters sighed in the Louisiana heat. The wood groaned under dampness and age. But at night, when the wind was still and the bayou silent, it did something else. It laughed. Not the laughter of children at play, not the laughter of joy or reunion. This was a sound sharp as broken glass, ragged as chains drawn across stone, rising from the plantation's bones as if the house itself was possessed of memory. Locals whispered of it in hushed tones, crossing themselves when they passed the long dirt road that led to its gates, the house that laughed at night. They said if one pressed an ear to its rotting walls, the timbers would tell stories, and the stories would never leave you whole. The mistress's daughters were raised within those walls, nursed on wealth, cruelty, and silence. Their giggles began as any children's might, bright, innocent, unknowing. But something in that house sharpened the sound, blunted its sweetness, and carved it into something else. Laughter became a blade, a warning, a song sung only to mock the chained men who served under their father's whip. "Did you hear it, Clara?" one girl would whisper, leaning in close to her sister as the candlelight trembled. "Yes," the other would reply with eyes wide and eager. "The walls are laughing with us." And so the games began. The house was a tutor, its voice a low drone in the rafters, guiding them with echoes. They learned to walk softly so the floors moaned like an audience. They learned to strike the walls just so, making hollow spaces reverberate like a drum. At night, when slaves were locked in the quarters, their muffled cries mingled with the creaking timbers until the whole house became a cruel orchestra. Neighbors who visited in daylight found nothing amiss. The white columns shone, the gardens bloomed, and the daughters curtsied with a rehearsed gentility. But when evening fell and the lamps flickered, the house leaned forward like a conspirator, groaning with its strange mirth. Guests swore they felt it watching them, as though laughter simmered behind the walls, waiting to burst forth. There was one night, the storm night, that sealed its name in whispers. Rain pounded the roof, thunder split the sky, and lightning carved white scars across the land. The daughters gathered in the parlor, their silk gowns damp at the hems, their eyes wild with delight. A man was brought in, chained and beaten, his silence already bought by lash and hunger. The storm's roar should have drowned every sound, yet the house amplified the laughter. It rolled down the halls, crept beneath doors, rose from the floorboards themselves. "Do you hear it?" one girl cried, pointing upward as the ceiling beams groaned. "It's laughing with us," the other answered, almost reverent. The slaves in the quarters swore they felt it too. Even locked away, they heard the laughter. Rattling nails loose from wood, filling the night like a second storm. Some pressed their faces to the dirt and prayed, but their prayers returned twisted, mocking, drowned in unseen chuckles. The mistress herself, a pale figure in lace, dismissed their terror. "It is but the wind in the beams," she claimed, smiling with lips too thin. Yet even she flinched when the house answered her, a low creak that sounded like a throat clearing, a reminder that denial did not banish the truth. By dawn, the man who had been brought into the parlor was gone. His absence was never explained. The daughters only giggled more, their voices echoing strangely, as if another set of mouths, hidden, invisible, giggled with them. The house, they said, had taken its first prize, and from that night onward, every storm was greeted with uneasy dread, for the laughter did not stop. It grew bolder, more insistent, filling the air with a kind of madness. It seemed to seep into the girls themselves, reshaping their voices, until even their daytime laughter carried a serrated edge. Years later, when travelers came down the dirt road, they described the place the same way, not as a home, but as a theater of cruelty, with the house itself an eager audience. Slaves spoke of hearing whispers in the walls, not words but giggles, high, cruel, endless. Some claimed to see faces pressed in the warped wood, mouths open in frozen mirth, eyes hollow as knots. The house laughed, and those who lived inside laughed with it, until laughter and cruelty were indistinguishable. And then, one moonless night, the laughter faltered, not because it grew weary, but because it was joined by something else. A new sound buried beneath the cackling timbers, a low groan, guttural, inhuman, a voice that did not laugh but waited. The daughters paused in their games, candles trembling in their hands. "Did you hear it, Clara?" one whispered. "Yes," the other breathed, her face pale. But that was not the house, and as the silence thickened, the shutters shuddered, the floorboards swelled, and from beneath the parlor came the faint clinking of chains. Not laughter now, but chains, shifting where no man was supposed to be. The house laughed no more that night. It only listened. The house grew hungrier with every passing season, and the daughters, who once played with ribbons and dolls, began to prefer other trinkets. The plantation was filled with iron, forged for control, built to bind, yet in their hands the chains became something else. They were not tools of labor, not punishment alone, but ornaments, toys of cruelty, trophies to flaunt. The rattling of iron became a language in that place. Every link spoke of weight, of ownership, of flesh pulled down by metal. In the daughters' games it became music, cruelly orchestrated. The halls carried the metallic sound, echoing with the rhythm of suffering, until it seemed the very rafters hummed in tune with misery. They learned early how to fasten shackles too tightly, how to polish the cuffs until they gleamed under candlelight. At dinner, while guests raised crystal goblets, the girls would whisper to one another, "Do you hear them? Listen to the chain. They sing for us." Their laughter would follow, sharp, mirthless, and the house would groan in approval. In time, they began to adorn themselves with these emblems. Small chains worn as bracelets, thin iron loops as necklaces, charms carved from broken cuffs. They turned suffering into jewelry, cruelty into decoration. It was said the eldest daughter wove a ribbon through a set of tiny shackles and tied it around her waist, declaring it her belt of fortune. The youngest wore a fragment of a collar as if it were a locket, clutching it to her breast as she giggled. The slaves noticed, though they dared not speak. Their chains were no longer simply restraints, but playthings for those who held power. At night, when the work was done and the air thick with sorrow, they heard the daughters parading down the halls, dragging long lengths of chain behind them as though they were bridal veils. The clinking was worse than whips, for a whip stung and ended, but the chains promised no end. One night, a storm raged and thunder clawed across the sky. The daughters gathered in the parlor again, but this time they demanded silence. "Let the chains speak," the elder whispered, her eyes bright as lantern flames. They fastened iron, cuffs around a man's wrists and ankles. Not to restrain him, but to make him part of their orchestra. They tugged the lengths in rhythm, swaying as if to music, their voices humming in cruel mimicry of hymns. The house joined in. The beams groaned, the floorboards creaked, the nails in the walls shivered loose, until the parlor filled with a sound that was not thunder, but laughter woven with iron. Neighbors swore they could hear it carried through the fields, a metallic chorus that rose above the storm. "How sweet the sound," one daughter whispered. "Like bells," the other answered. But the man they shackled did not speak, though his eyes burned. The chains sang, but his silence held a weight heavier than iron. From that night the house demanded more. The daughters began to collect chains as others might collect jewels. Some they displayed along the mantel, gleaming in the firelight like garlands. Others they hung in the hall, clinking softly whenever anyone passed, as if whispering. Guests grew uneasy, remarking that the decor seemed barbaric, but the mistress silenced them with a thin smile. "Children will make their play," she said, though her voice trembled as if she too felt the house breathing closer. The slaves, however, told another tale. They whispered that the chains were no longer empty ornaments. They said they heard voices in the clinking, voices of men who had vanished, voices swallowed by the games. Some swore that when the moonlight struck the metal just right, they saw faces glinting there, twisted, frozen, mouths open in screams that never ended. Still the daughters laughed and still they played. They began to weave chains into their dances, dragging long lengths across the floorboards, twirling until sparks lit beneath their feet. Each spark they called a soul set aflame. "Watch them burn," the elder whispered one night, pointing at the glowing embers that flared when chains struck wood. "Yes," the younger replied, her face pale with rapture. "They burn for us." But the house had grown restless. Though it echoed their laughter, though it hummed with their cruel music, something else stirred beneath. The chains began to move when, untouched, swaying in still air, clinking in unison as if directed by unseen hands. The daughters giggled at first, clapping their palms, delighted at the magic of it. Yet the slaves saw deeper. They saw the way the chains reached, as if hungry, as if remembering. On a night when the moon was hidden, one of the daughters rose from her bed, called by the faint jingling from the parlor. She followed barefoot, her white nightdress dragging like a shroud. There she found the chain swinging gently though no breeze stirred. She laughed, reaching out, and looped one length around her wrist as though it were a bracelet. The chain tightened. Her laughter turned to a gasp, her gasp to a scream. But the sound was swallowed by the house. The iron pulled taut, dragging her toward the mantel where other lengths swayed like serpents. By dawn, she was found collapsed upon the floor, pale, bruised, trembling, but alive. She said nothing, but her eyes no longer sparkled. From that day on, she never wore chains again. Yet the house seemed hungrier still, its groans louder, its laughter more insistent. The younger daughter carried on the games alone, but even she began to pale, her laughter breaking, faltering as the chains grew restless. The slaves knew what the daughters would not admit. The ornaments were no longer ornaments. The chains had tasted amusement, had been fed with laughter, and now hungered for something greater. They were no longer decorations, but offerings, offerings that demanded more. And on the next storm night, when the thunder rolled low across the bayou, the chains began to sing again. But this time the song was not for the daughters. It was not for the mistress. It was for the ones who waited in silence. The parlor was not meant for light. Though tall windows faced the gardens and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, somehow the room remained dim, as if the shadows themselves had grown roots and refused to leave. Even at noon, the sunlight faltered there, turning grey, weak, unsteady. At night, the parlor became a hollow heart, a place where the house's laughter gathered and swelled until it spilled into the halls. Behind the double doors, games began. These were not games of cards or of music, not the entertainments of gentility. The mistress's daughters had claimed the parlor as their theatre, their stage, and their altar. The walls themselves bore witness, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to recoil from what they were forced to see. The daughters called it their room of delights. The slaves called it the room where voices disappeared. Neighbors were never invited there, not even family. What happened in the parlor belonged to the house alone. On storm nights, the room was alive with echoes. Shackles rattled against floorboards, laughter mingled with cries that were muffled, swallowed before they could rise. The sound did not carry outside the plantation, but it did not need to. It pressed itself into the wood, into the plaster, into the velvet curtains that hung limp like the tongues of drowned men. Anyone who stepped into the parlor after such nights said the air itself was thicker, damp with something unseen. The sisters delighted in their shadows. Candles were placed not to banish the dark, but to shape it, to stretch their own forms monstrously across the walls. They laughed to see themselves elongated, twisted, dancing in grotesque silhouettes that loomed above their prisoners. "See how tall I am," one would whisper, spreading her arms so the shadow bent like a spectre. "See how small you are beside me," the other would sneer, crouching so her shadow swallowed the man at her feet. The men brought there learned quickly that resistance was useless. Chains silenced them. But worse than the iron was the darkness itself. In the parlor, sound carried strangely. A whisper near the fireplace could be heard, as though spoken into one's ear. A laugh at the far end could circle back, repeating itself faintly, like an echo from the rafters. The room multiplied cruelty, made every sound immortal. "Do you hear it?" the elder daughter often asked. The walls remember, and indeed they did, for when silence fell, a different noise arose. Faint at first, but growing, like a chorus under the floorboards, groans that did not belong to the living. The chains shifted, though untouched. The candles guttered, though no wind stirred. The shadows, too, began to move differently, no longer matching the gestures of the daughters, but swaying, bending, trembling with a will of their own. The mistress herself dared not enter. She passed the doors at dusk with eyes averted, flinching at the faint clink of metal that leaked into the hall. She warned her daughters, but her warnings were thin, brittle things. "Do not spend so much time in there," she whispered once, her voice dry as parchment. "It is not a room for children." But the girls were no longer children. Their laughter had sharpened into cruelty, their games into rituals. The parlor was theirs, and the house approved. One evening, long after the slaves had been locked away, the younger daughter slipped into the room alone. She carried a candle, its flame weak against the weight of darkness. The chairs loomed like crouching beasts, The piano in the corner stood silent, its keys faintly gleaming like a row of teeth. She set the candle down and whispered into the air, "Are you here?" Something answered. It was not words, not sound as the living know it, but a shifting of shadows, a sway of chains that rattled, though no hand touched them. Her lips curved into a smile. "Yes," she whispered, "I hear you." From that night on, she spoke to them, the unseen, the unheard, the ones who lingered in the parlor's corners. She asked them questions, and though no human could discern their answers, she swore she heard replies in the flicker of flames, in the groan of beams, there the heavy breath of silence. The elder daughter mocked her at first. "You talk to shadows like a fool," she hissed. But even she grew pale when the shadows shifted of their own accord, forming shapes that did not match either sister. Forms tall and hunched, forms that leaned closer each time the girls laughed. The slaves knew better. They whispered that the parlor had become a tomb of the living, that every laugh fed something that could not be seen. They said the daughters were not the only ones who played their games now. Something else had joined them, something born of the house's hunger and the weight of chains. One night, the girls demanded a new game. They brought in a man whose eyes burned with hatred, though his body trembled with exhaustion. They shackled him in the center of the room, set candles around him in a circle, and told him he was to be their actor. The game was simple. He must remain silent as they taunted him, as they struck the floorboards, as they danced around him dragging their ornaments of iron. If he cried out, he would lose. If he stayed silent, he would win. But the parlor had its own rules. As the girls circled him, the chains began to rattle without touch. The shadows grew longer, reaching toward the man, clawing across the walls. The girls laughed, delighted by the spectacle. "He is losing already," the younger cried. "Look how he shakes." But the man did not cry out. He clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the floor. His silence grew heavier, thicker, until even the laughter faltered. The shadows bent closer, their forms wrapping around him, their mouths gaping wide. The girls stopped. Their laughter died in their throats. For in the silence that followed, another sound rose, not his voice, not theirs, but a chorus of whispers that filled the parlor, rising from the very walls. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, cruel, vengeful. The man's silence had been accepted, but not by the sisters. It had been accepted by the house. When they finally unchained him, the man's eyes were glazed, his lips twisted into something like a smile. He walked out without a word, and the sisters did not stop him. For behind him, the chains continued to sway, and the shadows continued to move, though no one remained within them. From that night, the parlor changed. The laughter of the daughters was no longer the loudest sound within it. Their voices had become only part of a larger chorus, a chorus that the house itself seemed to conduct. And each time they lit the candles, the shadows leaned closer. The house did not sleep, though its windows were dark. At night it inhaled and exhaled through its beams, its breath seeping into every room, stirring curtains and rattling latches. And in the parlor, where shadows no longer obeyed the living, the mistress's daughters fed their cruelest joy. They called it delight, though there was nothing sweet in it, nothing tender. Delight to them was the spectacle of a body trembling under chains, the crack of silence breaking into sobs, the shiver of power when laughter cut deeper than any whip. The parlor had become their confessional, their theater, their altar. The elder daughter, sharp-eyed and cold, delighted in precision. She arranged the chains neatly, aligned the chairs, set the candles at measured distances, so shadows would converge like a crown above the victim's head. She believed cruelty should be orderly, ritualized, given the shape of ceremony. "They must learn to kneel as if in church," she whispered, her voice thin as a needle's point. The younger daughter, feverish and restless, delighted in chaos. She dragged chains across the floor for the noise, overturned chairs just to watch shadows stagger, smeared candle wax along the arms of captives so they twitched and hissed like animals. "They must sing for us," she laughed, whether in words or in screams. Between them, the parlor grew fat with suffering, and the house approved. It was not only the enslaved who were brought there now. The sisters began to lure others into their games. A tutor who had once scolded them for idleness, a neighbor's son who had dared to sneer at their mother, even a visiting preacher whose sermons dripped too heavily with piety. None returned quite the same. Some left silent and broken, their eyes fixed on nothing. Some fled the plantation entirely, never to be seen again, and some did not leave at all. The sisters buried these absences beneath a veneer of laughter. Their delight was endless. But with each new cruelty, something else stirred. The walls of the parlor began to sweat even in winter. The velvet curtains grew damp, darkened by stains that no hand had spilled. Shadows lingered even in daylight, huddled in corners, whispering against the floorboards. The enslaved whispered among themselves, "The house eats what the daughters feed it." They avoided the parlor, crossing themselves when passing its doors. Even the mistress no longer scolded her children. She simply walked the halls with her gaze fixed on the floor, her lips pressed into silence, as if she feared her own house might listen. But the daughters, they thrived. One evening, they gathered in the parlor without a captive, without chains. They lit the candles and stood in the center of the room hand in hand. "We are enough," the younger murmured, her breath trembling with excitement. "We do not need them anymore." The elder nodded, though her face was pale. "If we are to be queens, the house must crown us." The shadows obeyed. As the candles guttered, the sisters' forms stretched higher than the ceiling, monstrous silhouettes that bent and swayed, as if animated by unseen strings. Their laughter filled the room, but it was not theirs alone. The walls laughed with them, the portraits, the floorboards, even the chains clinking on their own as though clapping for a performance. In that moment, their delight became worship. For what they fed, the house had begun to feed them in return. Their cheeks flushed with feverish glow, their eyes glimmered like candle flames, and their voices carried farther than voices should, echoing through the parlor as though multiplied by a dozen mouths. "Do you see?" the younger cried. "We are not cruel, we are chosen." "Do you hear?" the elder answered. "The house sings for us." But beneath their triumph another sound swelled, the groaning chorus of those who had suffered there. Whispers bled through the walls, words rising in fragments, names, prayers, curses. The parlor shook with their weight. The sisters only laughed louder. They thought the voices were their choir, their proof of divinity. They did not notice the way the shadows leaned too close, the way the chains coiled like snakes at their feet, the way the candle flames tilted toward them as if reaching to consume. Their delight had become a feast, and they were no longer the only ones at the table. That night, long after their laughter ceased, the parlor remained awake. The windows trembled, though no wind touched them. The portraits' painted eyes glistened with moisture, and the chains swayed slowly in rhythm, as though rocked by unseen hands. And if one pressed an ear to the parlor door, one might hear a new sound, faint, wet, and rhythmic. Not laughter, not crying, something in between, something chewing. They had broken many men, but not him. The sisters had grown accustomed to screams. They measured their amusement by the pitch of agony, by the length of a cry, by the way a voice shattered into pleading. Screams were their currency, their hymnals, their proof of power. And yet, there was one who did not scream. His name had been taken long before the sisters were born, folded into the ledgers and forgotten. Among the enslaved, he was simply the silent one. He carried his chains without protest, endured their games with a stillness that unsettled even the cruelest among them. His flesh bore the swollen welts, the bloodied cracks, the burns of wax, and the bruises of rope. Yet from his lips came nothing. Not a cry, not a word, not even a sigh. The younger daughter hated him for it. "He mocks us," she hissed, pacing the parlor. "Every silence is laughter swallowed. Every silence is defiance." She pulled at his hair, pressed needles to his palms, let the iron bite into his wrists. But his eyes never wavered. The elder daughter studied him with something colder. "No," she whispered, "it is not mockery. It is something else." She leaned close to his face, her pale eyes scanning the darkness within his. When a vessel does not spill, it is because it is full. But what fills him? They could not know. None could, for silence is not emptiness. Silence is weight, and his was heavier than chains. At night, when he was dragged back to the quarters, the others avoided him. They whispered of the way his shadow stretched too far, reaching beyond the walls. They whispered of how his wounds never festered, how the rats would not gnaw his scraps, how even the dogs lowered their tails and whimpered when he passed. "He has given his pain to something else," one muttered, refusing to meet his gaze. Something that waits. The house seemed to sense it too. In the parlor, where shadows writhed like smoke, His silence grew louder than the sisters' laughter. The walls leaned toward him. The chains trembled when they touched his skin, as though eager to taste what he contained. Still he endured. The sisters escalated their cruelty. They starved him, lashed him until his blood pooled on the parlor floor, branded his chest with the family crest. The younger shrieked at him, "Scream, damn you! Show us you are still flesh." Her voice cracked into hysteria. "You will not make me small. You will not!" But he did not scream. His silence gnawed at her mind. She began to hear it in her dreams. Not emptiness, but a low and steady hum like a swarm of wings behind the walls. She woke sweating, clutching at her ears, insisting she could hear him even in sleep. The elder daughter, though outwardly calm, began to keep her distance. She could no longer look into his eyes. She swore she saw movements within them, as though two shapes shifted behind the dark pools. She whispered to her sister, "We must not break him. To break him would be to open him, and to open him." She trailed off, trembling, as if afraid of her own thought, but it was too late, for something darker than pain had begun to take root in him. It was not vengeance, not yet. It was patience, patience so deep it had teeth. He fed it with every lash, every burn, every attempt to draw a scream from him. He was not empty, he was filling. And the house, that hungry old beast, began to listen. Its beams groaned when he was dragged across its floors. Its walls creaked louder when his blood was spilled. The portrait's eyes seemed to shift toward him, no longer mocking but wary. One night, as the candles burned low in the parlor, the younger daughter leaned close to him again. Her lips brushed his ear. "Tell me why you do not scream," she whispered, her voice trembling with something she would never admit was fear. And for the first time, his mouth opened. No scream. No cry, only a whisper, low as dust, soft as the settling of ash. "I'm saving it." The sisters froze. Even the chains went still. The younger recoiled, trembling. Saving it? For what? The silent one did not answer. He closed his mouth, lowered his head, and let the silence settle once more. But now it was not silence alone. It was a promise. The parlor grew colder. The candles shrank as if recoiling, and in the farthest corner of the room, shadows bent toward him like supplicants bowing before their king. The storms of Louisiana did not come softly. They broke across the sky like the tearing of cloth, thunder rolling in long, endless growls that shook shutters loose and rattled every pane of glass. When lightning split the heavens and drenched the fields in ghost-white light, the people whispered prayers. But inside the great house, where prayers were already unwelcome, the storms were invitations. For when thunder roared, the daughters of the Mistress gathered their feast. They did not dine on bread or meat. Their table was not set with silver or crystal, though both glimmered in the cabinets nearby. Their feast was agony, and their wine was the trembling of men shackled and bent before them. The storm provided cover, thunder swallowing the cries so neighbors would not hear, though some swore they heard still. Voices carrying between the cracks of lightning, warped and elongated, like the wails of the dead. The elder daughter presided over the spectacle like a high priestess. She wore gowns too fine for the parlor, lace brushing against the damp wood, her hands white against the goblet she raised. She declared each game as though giving benediction. Which man would be made to crawl across the floorboards, which would be bound until his shoulders cracked, which would be burned with wax until skin blistered. The younger daughter danced among them, restless, spilling wine as she laughed, pressing the rim of her goblet to their lips so that blood mingled with drink. "Taste," she whispered, her breath fevered. "Taste what we drink in your pain." The house trembled with thunder, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside. Chains rattled, voices broke, laughter climbed to shrieks, yet always beneath it all there was silence. The silent one. He was always there, a centerpiece of their amusement. Though beaten, burned, and bound, he gave them nothing. His silence grew louder than any scream, swelling into every corner of the room until it pressed against the sisters' ears. Still, they tried. They took turns pressing their cruelties against him, laughing louder with each failure. "He is a feast that will not be eaten," the younger complained, pouring wine across his face. "He starves us with his stillness," but the elder only frowned. "No," she murmured, gazing at him through flickering candlelight. "He feeds us something else, something heavier." The storm answered with a crash that shook the parlor walls. The sisters raised their goblets in unison, lightning flashing across their pale faces. Around them, the enslaved knelt like unwilling offerings, the chains binding their bodies gleaming like veins of molten iron. And the house drank too. Drops of blood seeped into the floorboards and did not dry. They vanished into the wood as if swallowed, leaving behind dark stains that widened with each storm. The candles burned lower, yet their flames bent always toward the Silent One, as if drawn by the gravity of his silence. And when thunder shook the roof, some swore they heard not just thunder but chewing, a deep, wet gnawing from within the beams, as though the house itself had teeth. The sisters mistook it for triumph. They lifted their cups higher, laughing with lightning, drunk not on wine but on cruelty itself. "The storm drowns the world," cried the younger. "Only we remain." But in the shadows where lightning did not reach, eyes opened. Not the eyes of men, not the eyes of animals, eyes older, darker, hungrier. They flickered across the walls, watching the feast as though it were a ritual meant for them, and still, the Silent One remained unmoved. When the storm broke at last and the rain poured in torrents against the house, the sisters collapsed in the parlor, drunk on their amusement, their gowns stained with both wine and blood. They leaned against each other, breathless, believing themselves queens of a kingdom only they could rule. Yet in the silence that followed the storm, one sound lingered. It was faint at first, like the dragging of something across wood, then louder, scraping, steady, deliberate. The sisters stirred, their smiles faltering. The captives lifted their heads. The chains rattled on their own. The Silent One had not moved, but the sound came from him, from within him. Something was stirring there, louder than thunder, heavier than chains. A sound not of pain, but of arrival. And when the sisters leaned close, their faces pale in the dying candlelight, they swore they heard it, a voice deep and patient, whispering from inside his silence, "The feast is not yours." There were no rules written in ink, no laws etched in ledgers, yet every man who entered the parlor knew them by heart. The game had been played too long. Its shape passed through whispers, through scars, through the silence of those who never returned. The first rule was endurance. To endure without faltering was to live another day. To collapse, to resist, to break, that was to vanish. Not in freedom, not in mercy, but in erasure. The second rule was silence. Those who lost were not spoken of. Their names dissolved from tongues, their faces left unpainted in memory. The sisters forbade it, but even if they had not, the enslaved themselves refused, for to speak of the vanished was to call them back, and no one wished to see what returned. And the third rule, unwritten yet carved into bone, the house kept score. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight of absence. The walls grew swollen with voices that could not leave. Eyes lingered in corners, not of the living but of those erased. On moonless nights, the enslaved swore they saw them. Faint faces pressed against the grain of wood, mouths frozen in half-formed cries, fingers reaching through knots and cracks only to withdraw again. The sisters reveled in it. "The floor is our ledger," the elder declared, her pale hand stroking the boards as one might stroke the spine of a beast. "It remembers who endures and who falls," the younger laughed louder, "and so it grows fat with losers." Their games became more elaborate. They strung ropes from rafters, forced men to crawl through mazes of chairs, made them balance on trembling knees while holding burning candles. The sisters clapped their hands when a body fell, delighted when chains scraped against the floor, when the sound of collapse mingled with thunder, but the house clapped too. Its beams groaned in rhythm with their laughter. The floorboards thudded like drums beneath each fall. The portraits swayed in their frames as though leaning closer to watch. The Silent One remained. He endured every turn, not with triumph, but with stillness. When commanded to crawl, he crawled. When ordered to balance, he balanced. When ropes cut into his flesh, he bled without sound, and the house listened, waiting. The enslaved began to whisper, "He is not playing their game. He is playing his own." For the longer the game continued, the stranger the parlor became. Shadows thickened even when the lamps burned bright. The air grew heavy, damp as breath against skin. And sometimes, when a man collapsed and was dragged beneath the floor, his eyes did not vanish. They lingered in the corners, watching, waiting, as though unwilling to depart until something was finished. The sisters ignored it, or pretended to. One night, during a storm that rattled every shutter, The younger daughter clapped her hands and cried, "Tonight we play without end." She spun in the parlor, wine spilling across her gown, her laughter shrill as glass. No sleep until every man has fallen, until the floor groans with them all. The elder raised her cup, her voice cold. "So be it. The game will end when the house decides." And so it began. One by one they were tested, crawling, bleeding, burning. One by one they fell, dragged away by hands unseen, swallowed into the floorboards with the sound of wet wood cracking. Their eyes followed, glowing faint in the corners, pressed against the walls like stains that would not fade. At last only the silent one remained. The storm shrieked beyond the windows, lightning flashing across his face, his body carved by chains, his flesh torn but his gaze unbroken. He stood in the parlor while the sisters circled him like wolves. Their laughter faltering, their wine forgotten. "Endure, and you win," whispered the elder, though her lips trembled. "Fall, and you vanish," hissed the younger, her eyes fever bright. But the silent one did neither. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his chains dragging like the tolling of bells. And as he moved, the faces in the corners stirred. The eyes blinked, the mouths opened. A chorus of whispers poured from the walls, from the floor, from the beams above. Names long forbidden, curses long buried, voices of those who had lost. The sisters staggered back, pale with sudden dread. The silent one spoke only once, his voice low and deep, carried not just by his lips but by the house itself. "The game without end ends tonight." The floor split, chains rattled, portraits crashed, candles died. And the eyes in the corners blinked wide, spilling across the parlor like stars unmoored from the sky. The laughter faltered first in the mirrors. At dawn, when the sisters passed the gilt frames that lined the halls, their reflections bent unnaturally. Smiles stretched too wide, eyes blinked out of rhythm, mouths opened though theirs remained closed. Once the younger daughter leaned close to admire her face, only to see her mirrored twin bare its teeth in a grin that was not hers, a grin wet with blood. She recoiled, wine glass falling from her hand, yet when she looked again, the reflection stood still, demure, obedient, and false. That same night, the chairs in the parlor began to move. Not dragged by visible hands, but nudged, shifted, arranged as though by some invisible host. Chains uncoiled on their own. Ropes slithered across the floor as if seeking throats. The elder daughter insisted it was nothing more than drafts, settling wood, the foolish imagination of servants. But her voice quavered. She no longer sat with her back to the room. The enslaved whispered in corners, their voices low, their eyes fixed on the shadows that gathered thicker by the day. "Debts," they said, "debts that cruelty cannot bury." For the house had been fed well, glutted on blood, on fear, on the endless games of the sisters. Yet now it hungered for something greater. The silent one's stillness had shifted it. His silence had seeded it. The balance of power, long chained to laughter, began to lean towards something older. The storms grew stranger. Thunder did not echo in the sky, but within the walls themselves. Lightning flickered across the ceilings, without touching the windows. Doors opened of their own accord, slamming shut only when someone dared to step across the threshold. And at night, shadows thickened beyond all reason. They bled from the corners, stretched across the floor, pooled at the feet of the sisters. Sometimes they rose higher than a man, swelling like columns, quivering as though breathing. Once, as the younger sister bent to light a candle, a shadow leaned down over her shoulder, its shape identical to hers but smiling with a mouth too wide. She screamed and the flame died in her hand. Still the sisters tried to laugh. Their laughter cracked like porcelain. It no longer filled the parlor. It echoed hollow, swallowed by silence, mocked by voices that spoke beneath it. The silent one remained ever still, his eyes two pits of night. When he moved, the shadows moved with him, stretching, bending, curling around his form like servants bowing. He said nothing, but he did not need to. The house spoke for him. The younger grew restless, near mad. "It is a trick," she cried, pacing the parlor, her gown torn at the hem, her hands raw from clutching at chains that no longer obeyed her. "The games are ours, not his, ours." The elder, pale and trembling, pressed her back to the wall, her goblet untasted in her lap. "The house has chosen," she whispered. "It no longer crowns us." The laughter that followed was not theirs. It rose from the walls, low and guttural, swelling until the mirrors rattled and the floorboards cracked. It was laughter stripped of joy, laughter fattened on centuries of cruelty. The sisters clutched each other, their faces drained of all pretense. As shadows slid across the room and the chains coiled upward like snakes lifting their heads. And then came the voices. Not screams, not sobs, but whispers, endless and layered, speaking the names of the vanished one after another. The names filled the parlor, pressed against the sisters' ears, made their teeth ache, their skin crawl. The silent one raised his head at last. His lips parted, and though he spoke no word, the shadows stirred as if obeying a command. The house turned, and the sisters who had ruled with laughter realized that their laughter no longer belonged to them. It was being taken, swallowed, devoured by the same walls that had once echoed it. The house was no longer their stage, it was their judge. The mistress first noticed it in the hush between storms. She sat alone in her chamber, oil lamp guttering low, her hands resting on fabric that no longer yielded to the needle. The silence was too deep, too weighted, and within it came the sound. Chains clinking, faint at first like distant bells. Yet the walls did not shake. No man stirred, no hand pulled iron links across stone. The sound came of its own accord, a rhythm without a source, a shackle without a master. She stiffened, for she had lived long enough within those walls to know the language of metal, the difference between chains dragged by bodies and chains that moved themselves. And this was the latter. A voice, not an echo. Her daughters, radiant still in candle-lit parlors, seemed blind to it. They drank, they laughed, they summoned their trembling subjects and forced them into games that should have ended with the last storm. But the mistress, watching from shadowed thresholds, saw what they did not. The slaves no longer cowered as before. Their eyes, hollow for so long, now carried a depth she could not name. They looked at her daughters not as victims at tormentors, but as mourners at children, sad, certain, patient. And around them, shadows gathered like an audience, thickening behind chairs, slipping across the floor like spilled ink. Still, her daughters shrieked and clapped, pouring wine, demanding silence, then demanding screams. They laughed until their voices cracked, and when their voices failed, the house itself supplied the sound. Mocking, echoing, turning their own mirth into a grotesque chorus that rattled window panes. The mistress pressed her hand against the wall one night and felt it pulse. Not a tremor of storm or settling wood, but a heartbeat slow and steady, as though the house itself had been quickened with flesh. She drew back in horror, but the pulse remained in her palm as though it had branded her. When she dared to confront her daughters, they only sneered. "Mother, the walls have always listened," the younger whispered, her lips slick with wine. "They love us. They will keep us." But the mistress saw otherwise. The walls did not love. They waited. The clinking of chains grew bolder. Now they rang in daylight, drifting through corridors when no one carried them. Once she passed the mirror in the grand hall and saw not herself, but the silent one standing where her reflection should have been. Still, immense eyes like twin abysses. She stumbled back, gasping, but her reflection returned, pale and wide-eyed, mocking her fear. The feast of amusement had curdled. The guests, flesh, shadow, memory, no longer knew their place. Chairs shifted when no hand moved them. Candles guttered when laughter peaked. Daughters danced, but their feet no longer echoed against the floor. Their steps were swallowed whole, absorbed into silence that thickened like blood. And at last one night the mistress found herself drawn to the cellar door. She had not opened it in years. Yet the chains beneath sang to her, clinking, clinking, each metallic note a whisper of names she had long forgotten. She lifted the latch with trembling fingers, and a wind rose from the blackness below, carrying with it 100 voices murmuring in unison, not screams, not sobs, a chant. Her daughters still played above, clapping their hands, but she knew now they were not alone. Their games no longer belonged to them. The house had gathered new players, players without flesh, players who did not tire, players who did not forget. The mistress closed the cellar door, pressing her back against it as if to bar the tide. Her eyes brimmed with the weight of a truth too long denied. She had sown silence into the foundations, with every cruelty overlooked, every laugh excused. She had mistaken silence for peace, obedience for order. But silence was never empty. Silence was patient, and now it had risen. The silence came not with fire, nor flood, nor storm. It came with a stillness so complete that the crickets fled the grass and the owls refused their calls. The house, swollen with years of screams and mirthless games, exhaled a final breath, and in that exhale, the world around it seemed to pause, listening. When morning came, the neighbors found the mansion collapsed in upon itself, its white columns split like bone, its windows shattered into 100 watching eyes. The earth had swallowed it in silence, leaving only ruins where once laughter rang like knives on porcelain. Yet silence was not all that lingered, for those who stood too near swore they heard it still, faint, fractured yet unmistakable, laughter. Not joyous, never joyous but hollow and thin, echoing as though spoken from a throat without flesh. It drifted from the wreckage with the scent of charred wood and wine gone sour, twisting through the cypress trees and hanging like a veil upon the bayou. The daughters were never found. Their dresses, their hair ribbons, their jeweled trinkets, gone as though the ground had eaten them whole. Some said they had been taken below, dragged into the cellar where chains had learned to sing. Others whispered they still danced, bodiless, their pale hands clapping in rhythm to a game no longer of their own making. The mistress's rocking chair was uncovered among the ruins, upright and unburned. It swayed with no wind, creaking as though she still sat within it. And if one dared to lean close, the fabric bore marks, not of age nor fire, but clawing fingers that had gripped from the inside out. At night, travelers along the road to Baton Rouge began to hurry past that ground, for the laughter carried far. It rose with the mist, curling beneath carriage wheels, slipping into the ears of horses until they reared and foamed. More than one wanderer swore they saw shapes in the broken frame of the house, men shackled yet standing tall, eyes alight with the patience of vengeance fulfilled. No prayer quieted the sound. No priest dared step onto that land. For this was no haunting born of grief. It was a game unfinished, a game that demanded players forever, and so the ruins remain. Children in nearby towns whispered dares to one another. Go close enough to hear the laughter, but not so close that it hears you. For if you pause, if you listen too long, you will understand the rules. Endure or vanish. The house fell silent once, and still it laughs still. The game has no end. Even in ruins the laughter endures, hollow, unbroken, waiting for the next soul to hear.